I'm sorry, I'm going to start again because I was giving my introductory speech muted, apparently. I'm sorry about that. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion entitled Internationalizing the Gothic. I would like to thank today's speakers, as well as those of you watching the event. A special thank you, of course, to Tony Alcalá and Miriam Guzman for the effort that went into putting together this event, even in very trying times. Thank you as well to the School of Humanities and Education and the Passion for Reading program at the Tecnológico de Monterrey, Mexico City, for hosting this event, and to Yvette, of course, for your technological support. We will begin this discussion with Anna Reed's paper. Let me introduce Anna first. Anna Juliet Reed is PhD in Hispanic literature. She is a full-time professor at the Universidad Autónoma del Estado de Morelos since 2001. Her research interests focus on the Gothic, 20th and 21st century Mexican literature and 19th century British literature. So if you are ready, Anna, you may go ahead and present your paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ulysses. As always as well, thank you very much to Tony and to Miri for organizing yet again the Gothic conference. Also, Yvette, thank you for your technical support. And also a very great thanks to Ulysses, because we were meant to be having this conference in Costa Rica, but obviously for the reasons that we already know, we're on this sort of uncanny doubling sort of effect, which is very, very Gothic, but it would have been nicer to be all together. But anyway, never mind, we're here virtually, etc. Okay, so again, thank you, good afternoon, and also thank you for the public for being here. My title of my paper is called Invasion Narratives, Otherness and the Fear of Degeneration at the Fin de Siècle. I'm going to try and do a sort of very short summary of what the real paper is because of time limits. So today I will address late Victorian anxieties concerning degeneration, atavism, and the fear of invasion at the heart of the British Empire. The Victorian period represents the culmination of the expansion of the empire on which the sun never sets. And here I'm quoting, obviously. It is also a century of progress, in inverted commas, yet at the same time, modernity can bring about its own conflicts, and Western knowledge may be subverted by other, more occult ones. Empire could also be contaminated by the unknown, thus destabilizing notions of national identity. There was a fascination with adventure narratives in the exotic, but at the same time, there's a fear that empire could either crumble or that Britain could be invaded by the other. Dracula's obviously the most famous example, or more or less the most famous example of an invasion narrative. The vampire travels from Transylvania to the port of Whitby and enters the heart of empire to expand his own. Britain is therefore invaded by a supernatural force which undermines Western thought and superiority. Today, I will be addressing this idea of invasion or possible invasion by abhuman, liminal, and metamorphic bodies. Transgressive and unnameable things rise up from the past to threaten or destabilize notions of identity, sexuality, and morality. The Victorian period was characterized by the systematic hierarchization of knowledge, displayed in museums and exhibitions. Botanical research was vital, and the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species revolutionized 19th century thought. However, his descent, the Descent of Man, published in 1871, goes even further, arguing that man, and I quote, probably derived from an ancient marsupial animal, and this through a long series of diversified forms from some amphibian-like creature, and this again from some fish-like animal, end of quote. Thus, man's identity is perhaps not so integral as previously thought. The human body is mutable, and if man can evolve, the opposite process can occur. Thus, Darwinian theories gave place to the concepts of racial, social, cultural, national, moral, and physical degeneration, as mentioned by Tony this morning. This is taken up by Darwin's followers, T.H. Huxley and H.G. Wells. In Wells's The Time Machine, the traveller reflects that he is a witness to a society in decline. I quote, "The ruddy sunset sets me thinking of the sunset of mankind," end of quote. This ties in with Max Nordell's treatise on degeneration, published in 1895 in English, in which he describes the reddened light of the dusk of nations, in which forms lose their outlines and are dissolved in floating mist. In other words, one of the characteristics of degeneration is its nebulous aspect, something which is reflected in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and Marlowe's memories are described as misty when he remembers his encounter with the dying Kurtz, crawling on all fours like a toddler in the middle of the jungle. Just like Fresleven, Marlowe's predecessor in the Congo, Kurtz turns native, no longer dedicated to the so-called noble cause. Mist appears in a time machine. The traveller first sees the sun flitting across the sky, but then recalls that the landscape was misty and vague. Mist doesn't just envelop exotic lands and the future, it also permeates 19th century London. For example, Lincoln's Inn and the rest of London in Charles Dickens' Bleak House, the River Thames in Heart of Darkness, and Dr. Jekyll's studio, reflecting not just physical nebulosity, but it also extends its spidery fingers, enveloping its web to capture the moral mistiness within late Victorian society. Until now, the mention of fingers is metaphorical. However, there is an explicit mention of them in H.G. Wells' short story, The Flowering of the Strange Orchid. The orchid collector, Winter Wedderburn, buys a perhaps unknown or undiscovered orchid found by a man who is now lifeless and inevitably bloodless among some exotic mangrove swamps. The withered orchid rhizome is cradled in Wedderburn's hothouse, a kind of recreation of the tropics within urban England, and its aerial rootlets are described as fingers. They later become leech-like suckers, tentacles that try to strangle Wedderburn in his orchid house and suck him lifeless. Here the British Empire is invaded by a tropical flower, but which is introduced and sold by the colonial adventurer. The question begs as to what or who is the parasite, the empire living off its subjects or the vampire-like orchid. However, invasion narratives don't just focus on a physical invasion. Although contradictory in a century of progress and exploration, the Victorians were also fascinated in the occult sciences, such as telepathy, hypnotism, and the belief in ghosts. In 1882, the Society for Psychical Research was founded, of which Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a member. In his short story, The Parasite, the narrator, Professor Gilroy, and author of his scientific journal and diary, undergoes, under his own free will, a mesmeric trance. This is performed by Miss Penalosa, a lady from Trinidad, a British colony. She is about 40 and apparently ugly. She uses a crutch, both as a third leg, but also as a kind of spiritual mesmeric wand. Although mesmerism as a different kind of knowledge is inserted, through mesmerism, a different kind of knowledge is inserted at the heart of the British home and undermines scientific knowledge. This occult science invades the domestic space, but it is invited in by Western science. Finally, the narrator turns native, he is contaminated, and after a skeptical approach, becomes a believer in mesmeric trances. Miss Penalosa exerts a sexual attraction over Gilroy. She represents a sexual, racial, and occult threat to Gilroy's reputation, whereby, under her influence, he becomes a criminal and madman, both representing degeneration. He also becomes a laughingstock at his local university. In this short story, the colonized subject penetrates the domestic space at the heart of empire and corrupts the rational and scientific thought of Western male discourse. I would also like to mention the concept of thing or thingness. This is with a capital T, and the unnameable. In A Time Machine, the traveller's last encounter with the future of humanity in inverted commas yet again, is with a moving black thing with tentacles hopping in a Red Sea. In Arthur Machen's The Great God Pan, Helen, Mrs. Beaumont, Mrs. Vaughan, in her various guises and multiple identities, is described again as a thing. She becomes the mystery to be solved in a city now riddled with crime, murder, and prostitution. However, she can only be solved and silenced by her suicide, as her threat to social, sexual, national, and moral norms is unsustainable for European man. Through her otherness, she awakes deep down fears of the unknown, of sexuality, of nighttime orgies, of the female body, of the new woman. Her abhuman body fluctuates between man and woman, human and animal, and something even worse. Her death scene, witnessed by Dr. Robert Matheson, recalls Darwin's assertion about the mutability of the human body, and I quote, "The skin and the flesh and the muscles and the bones and a firm structure of the human body that I had thought to be unchangeable and permanent as adamant began to melt and dissolve." End of quote. She is dangerous because she is a woman, but also because she is the offspring of Pan and a sinister doctor. She also makes her appearance as a femme fatale at the heart of empire, at the heart of young gentlemen who she contaminates in, again quoting, "the dark waters of the life of London, in the city of nightmares, the city of resurrections, in a very Gothic London." And this goes back to what Tony mentioned this morning regarding William Booth and the quotes he made about In Darkest England and A Way Out, published in 1890. Another example of a sexual threat within an apparently female body can be found in the novel The Beetle, published in the same year as Dracula. Again, it deals with an invasion of London by a foreign and metamorphic body. The ancient beetle seeks revenge against an up-and-coming politician who thwarted the beetle's sexual advances some 20 years before. This Egyptian thing fluctuates between male and female, human and beetle, and can change its form as well. The beetle transgresses everything and wreaks havoc in London, destabilizing national, sexual, and personal identity. Like Helen and the great god Pan, the beetle exerts its sexuality in unspeakable ways and makes men become effeminate. The novel explores anxieties regarding invasion, other knowledges, mesmerism, sexuality, the new woman, abhuman bodies, exoticism, degradation, and degeneration. That's to say, all these fears which were coming up at the end of the 19th century. So to conclude, although these literary works explore late Victorian anxieties regarding invasion and a possible decline of the British Empire, they can also be viewed, at least in my reading, as having a perhaps positive force in that they undermine empire and show that the colonized subjects can rise up and destabilize Western knowledge and white supremacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna, for an amazing paper in which you mentioned some of my favorite works like The Beetle and also The Great God Pan. We are going to continue now with our next speaker, Esteban Rojas Castro. He is an independent scholar with an MA in English literature from the University of Costa Rica. He has been a visiting researcher at UC Berkeley and an assistant professor and ESL instructor at the UCR. His academic interests include gender studies, science fiction and fantasy, and graphic novels. So thank you for being here, Esteban, and you can go ahead and begin your talk if you're ready. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ilse, and thank you everyone else for joining us. So let's just start. My paper is entitled Complacency, Taboo, and the Fear of Loss in Max Brooks's War Z, which I have a copy right here. It's one of my favorite novels, and I highly recommend it for anyone who definitely who are interested in zombies. It is a great zombie novel, and I've read it so many times that I've realized that it stands out from other zombie texts. As many other critics have pointed out throughout time, zombies have represented communist invasions, pharmaceuticals, biological warfare, consumerism, or dependency on technology. As Gothic monsters go, they can represent a myriad of things. But when I was rereading it, what I noticed about World War Z, and it's mentioned in text, that World War Z is a collection of memories. The novel is written as a series of interviews that the nameless protagonist does around the world to survivors of this global zombie apocalypse, to kind of figure out what their stories were and what happened before, during, and after the war. In the introduction, Max Brooks mentions that his mentor for the whole thing is George A. Romero, who was the famous film director of the zombie cult movies like Dawn of the Living Dead and the sequels. And Romero in an interview pointed out that for him, a zombie apocalypse represents a global change. And the stories are about how people confront that change or are unable to respond to it, most likely. So I realized that compared to other Gothic monsters or other texts where you can find a monster or an other, once that other monster is defeated, there is a return to the status quo. For the most part, if anyone else has an example of something that breaks that rule, please let me know. But what happens with zombies is that once there's a zombie apocalypse, there's irrevocable change. Things are not going to go back to the things that the way they were. You either die or you just are condoned to live in a wasteland for the rest of your life. Or what happens in World War Z, humanity fights back, and all of a sudden you're confronted with this new reality, and you're supposed to find your place in this new reality. So this is the main argument of my paper, that in a book like World War Z, where you have the classic tropes of zombies and their body horror and the rotting flesh and their faces and their walk, and you have the uncanny experience of another that looks human but really isn't human, that's alive but it's dead at the same time, and then you have the physical threat of this zombie could kill me. The stories aren't really about that, because as the book says, it's a collection of memories. So really I noticed that the novel is more about overcoming a deeper fear, a metaphysical fear of losing what is known. So this is what I've called the horror of loss, that a challenge or a threat on what is known, on your reality, can be a horrifying experience, because it destabilizes the constructs and beliefs that sustain your reality. Now, this is, when I was writing this paper, it was a much bigger idea than I originally thought. So this is the first part of what I think might be a couple of more papers exploring the entire, this topic in the entire novel. So for brevity's sake, especially now, I'm just going to briefly talk about the two characters and the two chapters, their two interviews in the novel, that explain this, that for me explain this first part of the process of overcoming this fear of loss. They are Mary Jo Miller and Jessica Hendricks, and they each represent the safeguard against acknowledging that their reality has changed. The first one, Mary Jo Miller, for me, she represents this complacency in the world. So she is a realtor. She lives in the suburbs, American suburbs. And throughout her interview, there's this willful denial of the horrors that threaten her reality. So as she states in the novel, she doesn't really listen to the news on the radio, on the internet, about this zombie outbreak, this weird disease that's taking over the world. She shuts it off because her problems, her life has priority. And then when she's talking amongst her peers and coworkers, they very briefly mention the anxieties and fears that they have, but in that very Gothic way, they're afraid of voicing or giving name to this horror because that would give it credence and power. So Mary Jo starts putting up these walls to protect her psyche from this crumbling reality around her. and it spreads to the rest of her life. So when her children are acting up because they're worried and they don't have the adult distractions to shield them from that, her first instinct is to put them on prescription drugs like Ritalin and Adderall to silence that. And it gets to the point where the zombies are literally breaking into her front yard and their dog is barking, and she mentions in the book, like, oh, that just reminded me that I have to get this dog a bark collar because he always barks. So instead of paying attention to what the dog is barking at, her mind goes to, oh, I need to shut this dog up. So that is the degree of her denial. And the second character I analyzed, Jessica Hendricks, like I said, she represents this other way of just keeping these fears at bay, which is through taboo. So this is later in the story, the Great Panic has occurred, and the Great Panic is this global tipping point where the reality is out there that there's a zombie outbreak infesting the entire world. And Jessica, she's an adult when she's telling the story of this happened when she was a preteen, and the way her family reacted to these news. So the way taboo works in her story is that her parents are keenly aware of this need to protect her innocence, to protect their child's innocence. And there are some lines that they cannot cross. So here we're talking about transgression. So the first taboo is admitting ignorance or admitting powerlessness. That as a parent, you can't admit that you're weak, that you have to have all the answers. So her parent at the beginning, he's very enthusiastic of like, yes, we'll flee to northern Canada with everyone else because cold weather freezes, zombies will be safe, it'll be like an extended camping trip, everything will be great. But it's all a facade. And this is very closely related to the second taboo, which is exposing children to reality. In this very Gothic sense, the Gothic symbol of the home, preserving the family's integrity. When you're a refugee in World War Z, your home is your car. At least that was the case for the Hendricks. So the car becomes a proxy of their home, where reality becomes negotiated, filtered for Jessica as a means to control the environment around them. So when Jessica's in the car, she essentially hears no evil, sees no evil, and the family speaks no evil. So she puts her face down and covers her ears when they're driving around zombies. They pick up an unknowingly infected hitchhiker that her parents kick out of the car when Jessica's asleep. And then when they're in the refugee camp and everyone is sick and Jessica's very sick and starving, she mentions her parents are talking about it and that it is not an issue. It's not bad because they didn't do it. The neighbors did it. It is referring to cannibalism that the refugees had to resort to in order to survive. So they have this argument where transgression is renegotiated in order to fit in the reality that they used to cling to, without really accepting that reality is different already and there's no need to renegotiate this transgression. And very briefly, like this is developed a little bit more in my paper clearly. So this is just an introduction of the two characters I decided to analyze in this first paper, like I said, in a bit of a small series that I'm creating, where these characters are clearly just preserving the self from this fear of change, but it's ultimately proven to be an exercise in futility. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Esteban, for that really interesting talk about zombies and also contagion, which is something that we're all living nowadays somehow. We are gonna hear another speaker, with their talk. And the following speaker is Julio María Fernández Mesa, who holds a bachelor's degree of Lengua y Literaturas Hispánicas and a master's degree in Letras Latinoamericanas at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. He is currently a PhD student of Hispanic literature at the Colegio de Mexico. His main area of research is the criticism of Hispanic and English literatures. So Julio, please feel free and go ahead and present your talk. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Ilse, and thanks, Tony, for hosting the event. And I already have the pleasure of meeting Ilse and Anna. We met, I think, 3 years ago when the first International Gothic Association meeting was held in Puebla. And I am pleased to be here. But before I begin, I would like to make a little test because I had a couple of technical difficulties and I prepared a presentation which includes audio and video. So I would like to test it very quickly. And if it works, I'm going to start. So this is just a little test to test the audio and the video. So I'm going to share my screen. Just let me a minute. And please let me know if you can see it and also if you can listen to it.
I can see it.
And do you listen this? I'm going to play a little, just a couple of seconds of audio. Please let me know if you do.
Sure.
Have you heard that?
Not so far, Julio.
Not so far, meaning you heard it, but a little distant?
I don't know if the rest of you are hearing it.
Does anybody hear the audio? I'm going to play it again. Please let me know if you do, so I can begin.
Sure.
Did you hear it?
I still do not hear it, and the rest of the speakers, the presenters, are also saying that they are not able to hear it.
All right, just a minute. Yvette, you told me that I had to press 3 buttons, and then what do I have to do? Share computer sound? Is that it?
Yes, share computer sound, please.
So I'm going to run the last test. Please let me know if you heard the following audio.
Yes, that's a yes.
Yes.
Okay, thanks for your patience, and I'm going to begin now. Sorry for the technical difficulties.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Sure. Well, as Ilse already said, I am Julio María Fernández Mesa, and I'm going to talk about Junji's Ito adaptation of No Longer Human. I think we as readers, mainly as Western readers, are not accustomed to Asian media in general. That encompasses literature, video series, movies, comics, and of course, manga. I'm going to talk now about a manga adaptation of perhaps the second best known work from the 20th century in Japan, and that is No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. As we can see here, this is the first panel of my presentation. This is basically the introduction to the main story. For those who have read my paper that is linked in the Portals Congress portal, I have delved a little bit into the differences and how the work is structured and how Ito rewrites Dazai. For those who do not know, Osamu Dazai was a Japanese author who even today is very, very positively regarded. He, despite that, he committed suicide at a very young age with a war widow with whom he began a relationship. In this panel with color, Ito is trying to depict that. Here we see the main character, that is Dazai. He's drinking, and this is also the representation of that war widow. What I'm going to show next is basically the photographs from both of them prior to their double suicide. Here we see Dazai, and this is Tomie. As you can see, both of them were very young, and well, prior to Dazai's suicide, he finished his best-known work, No Longer Human, which is very, very famous because basically it depicts Dazai's life, and it's very autobiographical in its tone. Well, that novel is very, very popular in Japan. If you're interested in reading it, it's even in the public domain. I believe it's even translated to Spanish. Obviously, I read the English version, the English translation, but that doesn't deter any reader to approach to the text despite his language, his background, his cultural framework. Well, Ito is a horror Japanese mangaka who is very young. He was born in 1963, and he has become famous mainly because he has produced a lot of original work. I have read a lot of Ito's works, and I can say with confidence that all of his work is based upon horror. So that's why, at first glance, one may wonder, why does he adapt a novel that it's autobiographical in its tone, but it's not very clear in its horror approach? Well, I want to provide a brief summary of what I think Ito does by adapting this novel. In the upcoming panels, I'm going to talk about Ito's main technique, which is called the page turn. That is how he manages horror tension throughout the plot. And also, I'm going to talk about a little bit, I'm going to show a video about Rakugo performance. Rakugo, for those who read my paper, is Japanese storytelling in which the performer tells a story, comical in nature, mainly comical, with minimalistic elements. He sits on a raised platform, which is called kosa, using only a paper fan, which is called sensu, and a small cloth, which is called tenugui. And without standing, the Rakuga storyteller tells the story. The story always depicts a dialogue between two characters. He performs both characters, and they are distinguished by changes in pitch, tone, and gestures only. Ito chose that storytelling framework for his adaptation. And how did he manage to do that? So in the next video, I'm going to show how a performance of this type of storytelling is represented. So you can have a visual image, a visual representation of the point from where Ito departs. So this is a brief video. This is a story called Beans, Nimonase in Japanese. And as you may see in the upcoming 5 seconds, the the presenter gives the story outline, and then we hear the rakuga, storyteller. So let's begin. As you can see, this is the main summary. The little boy Saraikichi is eating salty beans at the kitchen. And I'm not going to read all of it, but suffice it to say, he misbehaves and eats the beans that do not belong to him. Therefore, the master is going to scold him.
味噌豆貞吉や貞吉旦那お呼びでございますか。台所で味噌豆を煮ている煮えたかどうか見てきておくれ。この鍋だな。味噌豆よく煮えてるよ。しゃもじがある。皿もあるよ。あっちあっち。うまい。おいしいね。
Well, as you have seen, this is basically how rakugo works. The performer uses very minimal elements to perform his story. There is basically no scenography, minus the paper fan and his clothes, and he's seated on the raised platform. Well, that's basically the framework for adapting No Longer Human. Now I'm going to explain how Ito, from that point of reference, adapts Dazai's novel. This is the traditional reading style in manga. As most manga stories are written, they flow from right to left, in contrast to how most written stories are told in West. So we began with the number 1. As you can see here, these little globes represent dialogue, and we follow the order presented by the numbers. Why is this important? Because Ito uses this way of telling his story, and that is how he manages to develop and represent horror. Let's see a couple of examples. For those who read my paper, I already explained this with much further detail, but I'm going to give a brief summary of 2 different panels. So let's begin. In this panel, we see first the eye of the main protagonist. He is called Jousa Oba. Just to recapitulate, this story, both the Dazai's novel and the Ito's adaptation, depicts the harrowing arc of Jouba Osa, the main protagonist, who is afraid of everyone. His family, his friends, the women he became acquainted to, his personal workers, even his enemies, his father, the ghost of his inner self, his inner demons. And in the novel, and also in the adaptation, it is never explained why Oba is afraid of everyone. That is why the novel is very rich to interpretation. So I'm going to explain the page turn. As we see here, we first catch a glimpse of Oba's eye. We see also a little dialogue, and then we flow to a somber figure who is approaching to this character. He is called Horiki. Horiki is a very despicable and exploitable friend that is on quotes of Oba, because he is always trying to take advantage of him, economically and by other means. So then we see the other panels in which Oba is walking. As you can see, he is barely watching anybody else, but all the other characters, particularly women, are looking at him, and we see the reactions on their faces. Some of them are fascinated, or others are surprised, others are basically wondering what is his deal. And then in the upcoming page, we're going to have our reveal. I chose this example because although it is not horror per se, it portrays how Ito manages this resource. And in the upcoming page, we see basically just Oba, who is smoking, who is like wearing an elegant kimono, and the only thing he says is impossible. But the emphasis is not on the words, but rather on the composition. You can see here his somber eyes, his demeanor, who despite being not horrific per se, it gives an uncanny feeling and eeriness to the composition. And I'm going to show another example. In here, we see as well Oba with a woman who is called Tsuneko. Tsuneko is a woman who is married, but her husband is already in prison. And despite that, he and her began a relationship, even though that's not well considered, that's not well regarded, but both do not care. And once they become close to each other, they began to plan their lives. For example, they began to live together, to eat together. She works in a cafe, he visits her frequently, they tend to eat together, etc., etc. But as the novel progresses and also as the adaptation unfolds, both of them think that their future is practically inexistent. Therefore, they plan something together. I'm not going to reveal what they do, but I'm going to just show you how the tension is built upon. So if we glance upon this first panel, they are at Kamakura, a shrine. And as we progress through the flow of the panel, we see how the characters are speaking to each other. They barely look at each other, despite their sharing, they're enjoying some candy. And as we progress, we see also the sea, the flow of the waves, and how they are walking in the beach. And as we find later in the upcoming page, they keep talking. But it is interesting to note that despite their having a dialogue, they barely look at each other's eyes. However, if we see basically the biggest panel of all the composition, we see Yoso looking at her. He first gives a non-wordly response, a silence, and then he says, "We'll be together in the next world," which in response makes Tsuneko silent. And then we keep seeing how they walk, and that's basically it. As you can see from this description of mine, that is how horror is managed throughout the whole story. And I cannot delve into much detail as I would want to, because the adaptation is very long, and I would deprive you of the pleasure of reading it. However, I wanted to show you this because this is how Ito basically constructs not only this adaptation, but all his work. Now I'm going to show you how he draws any character. This is a live presentation of Utsunaki, his most famous work. Here you can see the character. Then the plot of that story revolves around spirals and how spirals can change everything, physically, metaphorically, etc. So while I am going to explain a couple of things, look around this video. Basically, he manages to draw a little part of the neck and the shadows around the neck, and just watch how detailed he is while drawing. Ito says that it may take between 2 or 4 or even 8 hours to complete a single drawing, depending on detail, composition, complexity, movement, and other factors. But that is interesting to note because Ito is a very detailed individual, and although his work is not very long, it's very dense, very ample in significance. And I'm going to end this presentation by showing you a little extract from an interview conducted by Viz Media, his Western publisher. In this interview, he says basically what I just told you, how he manages to adapt Rakugo storytelling in his manga. And I'm going to finish this by showing you a final reflection about Ito's opinion on adapting No Longer Human, why he chose to do that. So let's hear the man himself.
こんにちは、ホラー漫画家の伊藤潤二です。人間失格をその日本のね夏目漱石の心に次いで今でも今まで一番2番目に売れた小説だったんですけど、読んだ人はいろんな感想を抱いてすごくシンパシー感じて評価する人もいれば全然分かんないっていう人もいてですね、人によって感じ方がこんなに違うのかっていうのがあるんですけど、私はやっぱり人間失格はホラーだと思ってますので、ちょっと名作は実はホラーだったっていうことに気づいてほしいなと思います。はい、
And before I finish my intervention, I want to remark that in my paper I made a comparison between this adaptation and also No Longer Human as a whole with Pedro Páramo from Mexican author Juan Rulfo. I think it is not a coincidence that despite our cultural differences, our different backgrounds, our different languages, both texts are very, very positively regarded, very well received, because despite all those differences, they depict horror. And I think horror may be the best known and most intense of human emotions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio. I thought it was fascinating how you mentioned these technical aspects about the medium, and even that chart that shows the order, the correct order in which to read manga. I had no idea. Thank you very much. We're going to move on to our next speaker. His name is Leonard Cruz, and he received his PhD from Yale University and is a professor of French at the University of Mary Washington. He has published extensively on modern French literature and culture. His most recent publications include articles on 19th century women's fashion and politics and French colonial architecture in Algeria. Thank you for being with us today.
Well, I get my presentation up. I want to add my thanks to Tony and Miriam for organizing this, and thank everybody for joining us as well. So as you see here, the title of my paper is Staging the Gothic on Paris's Grand Guignol Theater, 1897 to 1962. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Grand Guignol, the so-called theater of fear and blood in Paris. What I call in my paper a little bit later, a kind of niche entertainment venue in Paris. But before I start talking at least about the history of the Grand Guignol, I will start with a quote, and this is from Paula Maxa, who was probably the most famous actress at the Grand Guignol. And I think it not only demonstrates her understanding of why theater goers would go to this sort of entertainment, but perhaps why we are all always interested in horror and Gothic plot lines. When I go to bed, I look under the bed in fear. I fear the dark, the storms, the sea, the unknown, and my own darkness. So the Grand Guignol Theater began essentially in 1896 at 12 bis Rue Chapal in Paris in the Pigalle neighborhood, which is right next to the Montmartre neighborhood in the northern part of the city. A newspaper publisher named Maurice Magnier bought an old convent that had been desacralized in the 1789 revolution, not been used much in the century after that. A few times in the 1840s and 1850s, we see that it's used as a concert space. It's an important detail because, as you'll see in a few pictures later, most of the interior remained. It was very elaborately decorated with Baroque wooden carving and sculpture and so forth. And so that's an important detail to the Grand Guignol. This is obviously the exterior. So, as I say, Magnier had the intention of creating a black box theater. He named his theater the Théâtre Salon. He didn't have a lot of success. It was sold the next year to a fairly popular and successful playwright named Oscar Métainier, who renamed the theater the Théâtre du Grand Guignol. He as well didn't have much success, and a year later in 1898, the director became Max Moret, who really established the Grand Guignol as a kind of popular entertainment venue in Pigalle. From the outset, like many other theaters in Paris in the late 19th century, small theaters, the Grand Guignol was a repertory theater. So there would be generally a series of one-act plays for the evening. The Grand Guignol from the outset specialized in what were called the mœurs populaires and the faits divers, plays based on working class manners or themes. And the faits divers was a sort of convention of 19th century journalism, small items in newspapers, usually one or two sentences long, that described sensationalist crimes, kidnappings, odd events, and so forth. So at the outset, the Grand Guignol had its roots in 19th century naturalism, the naturalism of Émile Zola, the Goncourt brothers, on the stage, Henri Beck, and so forth, particularly in terms of its valorization of lurid details, degenerative families and behavior, and so forth. Under Moret's directorship, the Grand Guignol became an important entertainment venue in Paris. He developed a program that he compared to what he called the douche écossaise, a Scotch bath, in which he, in the repertory in the evenings, the program would alternate between horror plays, horror and Gothic plays, and sex farces, each with a kind of increased intensity. The douche écossaise, the Scotch bath, alternates between hot and cold water, and so that's what he compared this to. He's also very important in terms of the way the Grand Guignol was marketed. The Grand Guignol had horrific plays in the popular press in the late 19th and early 20th century. Theater critics talked about how people fainted during productions, and Moret even stated that because so many people fainted during their productions, he had a doctor on staff to attend to them. He also had plants in the audiences who would scream and sort of promote the kind of reaction that he wanted to bring about during the plays. The Grand Guignol was a small theater. And this is an example of the interior from 1947. It was a small theater. It only held about 280 seats. The seats were very close to the stage. In the back of the theater, the original chorus stalls of the convent were private boxes. You could put these screens up and be in semi-privacy while watching the plays. While the Grand Guignol finds its literary origins in French naturalism, its stagecraft really does originate in early 19th century French melodrama, itself very much influenced by the late 18th century Gothic novel. So French melodrama dominates Parisian popular stages up through the 1920s, and it's innovative in terms of the history of French theater by its use of lighting and special effects. In fact, these sort of migrate to magic theater in the 19th century and then are used on the stage of the Grand Guignol. So as when we think of the stage was, like the theater, a rather small one. You see an example of this here. The decorations are from the original chapel of the convent that the space was. The stage was fairly bare for most of its productions. There would usually be a backdrop of some sort, a few pieces of real furniture. Lighting was an extremely important detail, as were sound effects to create the sort of Gothic and horrific atmosphere of the particular plays. Makeup was tremendously important. So here, this is an image of a character being made up for one of the bloody plays on the Grand Guignol, and I have a series of these as well. This is a character making himself up for the stage, and then another character on the stage. And many of these effects were rendered on the stage. In this one, this is from a play from the 1920s. That's one of the kind of revenge plays where a woman has thrown acid on a man's face in the course of the play, and this is the effect. So one saw these sorts of things on the stage. There were also a lot of props used in the Grand Guignol theater to create these sort of horrific effects. And the actors and actresses talk in articles, subsequent articles, about the difficulty of acting on the Grand Guignol stage, because on the one hand, they were acting in certain roles, and they had their performance, but they also were like stage technicians as well, that they had to render all of these effects at the same time. One of the most, and I don't have a picture of this, unfortunately, one of the most amazing of the stage effects on the Guignol stage was a short play in which Paula Maxa begins the play as a living human being, and in the course of 3 minutes decomposes completely to a skeleton. I'll have more to say about Paula Maxa in a few minutes. So when we think of the plays, well, most of the plays for the Guignol Theater were original productions. There were some adaptations. Poe was adapted quite a bit, but most of the plays were original productions, and there were many thousands of these over the years. An element that seems to be a part of virtually all of these plays, 2 elements, fear and surprise. And one of the playwrights of the Guignol, one of the most prolific playwrights of the Guignol, André Delorde, wrote an article in 1927 called Fear in Literature, in which he talks about a kind of genealogy of fear from the late 18th century Gothic novel through the French melodrama, through the works of Poe, Baudelaire, Barbey d'Aurevilly, Villiers de l'Isle Adam, and ending up with the Guignol Theater. So there's always an element of not only fear, but then surprise as well, which you see here in the poster for one of André Delorde's plays. Another element of the surprise was, in fact, violence, explicit violence, graphic violence. So here we see an example of violence on the Guignol stage, all rendered with props and tricks and so forth. An example of probably Delorde's most famous play, in fact, a sort of mad scientist narrative with blood everywhere. I'll talk about that in a moment. So when we think about the plays on the Guignol stage, they fall into a lot of sort of formulaic kinds of categories. So we have plays about revenge, guilt, murder, premature burial, infanticide, insanity, insane asylums, mutilation, suicide, torture, helplessness, mysterious death, ghosts, vampires, violent crimes, among many others. And a lot of times these genres were combined, in fact. In terms of violence, I can talk about the biggest star of the Guignol, which was Paula Maxa, nicknamed the most murdered woman in the world. And in fact, there was a film that was made in 2018 by Franck Ribière, a French film, obviously, entitled just that, The Most Murdered Woman in the World. She was a star at the Guignol from 1917 through the 1930s and was reportedly murdered 10,000 times on stage. Some critics, you see one of these 10,000 times here, some critics call her the first scream queen, in fact. She was killed by being tortured to death with surgical instruments, being burned to death, being killed by a puma, being strung up and having been kissed by a leper, by hanging, by strangulation, by being shot with a rifle, and so forth, in fact. So the next part of my paper, which I don't really have time to go over here, is a kind of brief examination of one of the plays, a play from 1911 called Sous la lumière rouge, under the red light. If you want to read this in my paper, you can look at it there, in fact. It's a play that illustrates a number of the sorts of things that I've been talking about up to this point, but I ultimately conclude about the importance of the Guignol Theater in the history of theater, as well as in the history of Gothic and horror aesthetics, that the Guignol regularly moves back and forth across the boundary between the visible and the hidden, between the suggested and the revealed, as a kind of renegotiation of the element of the explicit in the horror and Gothic plotline. So the Grand Guignol closed definitively in 1962. its then director named Charles Nonon blamed the closure on the sort of aftermath of the Second World War. This is a quote from him. "Before the war, everyone felt that what was happening on stage was impossible. Now we know these things and worse are possible in reality." I will also say too that the Grand Guignol becomes upstaged in some fashion by the emergence of a certain kind of horror cinema in world cinema. So when we look at, for example, three watershed films from 1960, Hitchcock's Psycho, Georges Franju's Eyes Without a Face, and Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, those films, like the great Grand Guignol before it, move along in terms of revealing more graphically the horrific, rather than it being suggested, rather than it being hidden, it is revealed and it becomes explicit. And I think that's another sort of important detail to the demise of the Grand Guignol, that cinema had a more effective way of rendering these effects than the rather sophisticated stagecraft of the Grand Guignol. So that's where I guess I will stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for a fascinating paper about the Grand Guignol theater and also these technical aspects that generated or accentuated terror in it. I believe we are all ready now to move on to questions and comments from the audience. If you bear with me, I'm going to scroll up and down looking for those questions. And we can begin in the same order in which the speakers presented their paper. We can begin with a question for Anna Reed. And this is a comment and a question by from Oscar Feoli, who asks, in your experience, how difficult has it been for you to write about Gothic fiction? Have you found yourself too immersed in it sometimes?
Thank you, Elise, and thank you to the whole of the panel, and thank you, Oscar, for the question. Well, I think it's quite a difficult question to really answer, because I'm essentially immersed in Gothic fiction all the time and Gothic life all the time. Essentially, it's one of my passions. It's what I teach. It's what I read. Elise, after my presentation, said, that two of her favorite novels or novellas, The Great God's Pan and The Beetle. For those of us who enjoy this kind of literature, it's like delving into the dark side of humanity, the dark side of ourselves, going beyond appearances. I'm not actually answering your question by any means whatsoever, but it's sort of trying to think a little bit beyond and thinking about the horrors, etc. For me, it's part of my culture. I'm from Scotland originally. I'm from Edinburgh, which also has this sort of the idea of the double moral, doppelganger. We can think of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Confessions of what's it called? The Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. That's to say, this idea of duality is part of a Scottish inheritance, which comes from literature and also from an oral culture. But also it can be applied here to Latin America, as we've seen it in the other panels that we've been listening today and yesterday. And if I find myself immersed in it too much, but maybe yes, I do have a couple of dead ladies behind me. They're part of my bedroom sort of scenario. But I'd also like to sort of take it up a little bit about, for example, what Angela Carter said. We live in Gothic times, and that was in 79 or 76, so I can't quite remember the actual dates, but I think we still live in Gothic times. And taking up a little bit about what Esteban was commenting about, zombies and this kind of weird disease which is taking over the world. Well, what are we living now? We're living in a pandemic, but we're not living, just in a pandemic just now, but we're living previously sort of biological or chemical warfares, plagues. It seems to be like a constant in Gothic fiction. That's to say, we can't separate reality from fiction or fiction from reality. It's part of the same thing. We have this idea of like contamination narratives, pollution. Esteban, you also mentioned, you saw this idea of, the Great Panic, which takes us back to the idea of Pan, as in the god Pan, creating panic, panic, the idea of something contagious. So I think Gothic fiction is contagious. I hope, Oscar, with your question, you also find it contagious, which I assume you do if you're here in the conference. And well, I think that's really sort of the answer, which is not an answer, but it sort of ties in a little bit with what Esteban was also commenting about, the idea of zombies, and also the way that zombies have changed, from the Day of the Living Dead to something slightly more contemporary, something slightly more agile, let's say. So I think that's me for that question, unless Oscar, you've got any other comments. Ilse, I'll let you go back. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you also for connecting your talk also with Esteban, who's up next. We have some questions for Esteban, at least a couple. And there is a question from Tony Alcalá for Esteban, who says, what's your impression on the change from Romero's lethargic zombies and the rather fast runners we see in more recent adaptations of the zombie?
Right. Okay. Thanks, Tony, for that question. It's interesting because Anna just brought that up. To be quite honest, I haven't really given it much personal thought to it. Off the top of my head, I feel that the concept of the fast zombie, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, was first done in 28 Days Later in that film. It's relatively new, even though that movie was from the early 2000s. I think it might just stem from a more cinematic idea of zombies, like old slow zombies had already been passé, so it was just a way of making them maybe a little bit more threatening. And I think I haven't seen the movie in a while, but it's within that story. It's explained in text of why these are fast zombies. I forget if it was a type of virus, and it was like a rage virus. I could be mistaken. In terms of World War Z, I think it is important to clarify, because I noticed when I was telling people that I was going to work on this text, they said like, oh yeah, like the movie's like, no, I'm not working with the movie, because the only thing that the movie and the book have in common is the title. The movie is a very generic and bland zombie movie starring Brad Pitt. The zombies are fast, which they're not in the book, because Max, as an apprentice, as you will, to Romero, his zombies are slow and stiff and the very classic zombie. And something I didn't like that the movie did is that the movie, at some point, there's a cure, which Brooks is very clear that there is no cure. This is a natural occurring virus that has always been part of the planet Earth, and there have been a few small outbreaks here and then throughout history that were never really recorded widely, And World War Z was the first big one that it was inevitable that people were like finally understood that this virus is a part of planet Earth, but is now people and everyone have to learn to live with it. So again, sorry, to answer your question, I think fast zombies are really just a product of Hollywood and to sensationalize the text more, because they just film better, especially in that blockbuster kind of view. Yes, I'll hand it back to Ilse. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Esteban. We have 2 more questions for you, so please don't go away yet. There's another question from Oscar Fioli, who's asking Esteban, now that you mentioned Adderall, how common is it to find psychiatric meds in this type of texts?
Well, when it comes to drugs, I'm trying to rack my brain a little bit, see if I remember, but so besides that very explicit mention of Mary Jo having her kids on Adderall and Ritalin in order to calm them down so they stop paying attention to the world and start acting out because of this fear, of this anxieties that they don't understand, but they can pick up that something is happening in the world, and you can't stop children from talking in schoolyards and everything. The one big mention of drugs in the book was actually a big part, actually. There's this drug that's eventually proven to be a placebo called Phalanx. So when the outbreaks were starting to happen, pharmaceuticals, one character in particular, he's one of the interviewees, and he said, like, well, this is my moment to cash in. So he talks about this drug that was meant to combat rabies, because initially the disease was identified as a type of rabies. They called it African rabies to give it that very post-colonial edge to it of something foreign and exotic invading, especially the US, because this is an American pharmaceutical. And how it was sped through the FDA and got approval and lots of lobbyists behind it. But ultimately, the drug was just a placebo. It didn't do anything. It just gave people that peace of mind. And that is mentioned in the book as part of the motto or the slogan for the prescription drug. I think it was a piece of Phalanx, peace of mind, something along those lines. So people started taking this, thinking that it was going to protect them, and it didn't. And it's this peace of mind that people got with this drug. It really just lowered their defenses and lowered their guard as to the actual real danger that was happening around them. Sounds familiar to what we're going through now. And also want to make sure, so the idea for this paper, I had this idea since late last year, early this year, and it was a very, very, very Gothic coincidence that we happened to go through a pandemic this year, and then my choice of topic was a pandemic fiction novel. So yeah, so I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Esteban. Yes, unfortunate coincidence, unfortunately. We have one more question for Esteban, just very quickly, from Luisa Lazar. Do you think these anxieties over survival can be parallel to the current state of pandemic? And I think that you began answering it, and the anxieties and denial surging in so many today. I don't know if you would care to expand a little bit on that question.
Yes, I think there's definitely parallels. Rereading this book this year definitely hit differently than the other times I've read it before. And I remember having just really visceral reactions when I was reading this book this year. The other times it was very easy to just like point and make light of like, oh, these people, like they don't believe what's happening, they're being reckless. And all of a sudden you see the behavior right there happening in front of you of people being reckless, and playing with their lives and playing with other people's lives. But yes, so this, I touched upon it a little bit in the actual written paper, what Luis is asking about, this anxiety, this fear, that is really what I'm talking about in the paper as a whole, and the other ones, if I get the chance to write them. It all just comes down to this fear of losing our part in society and losing our part in the reality as we know it. There's a difference between, let's say, being in a zombie apocalypse and dying, than surviving it and being faced with the question of, well, what do I do now? Where do I fit? What do I do? And that's part of the topic. Those are some of the topics I'm going to be discussing and developing and later with the other chapters of, once people are safe and people start fighting back, coming to terms with the world as I knew it doesn't exist anymore. And I have to learn how to let go of that, and how there are some people that simply cannot do that. Call it a personality type, call it what have you. But the book is very good with those explorations and those sociological explanations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esteban. And we are going to move forward with a question for Julio Fernandez. Julio, you mentioned Pedro Páramo, and you mentioned having worked on Pedro Páramo alongside Japanese literature. Could you maybe expand on the idea, or compare and contrast perhaps these very different contexts through Gothic, of course? So how are, Japanese, more than Asian, how is Japanese Gothic comparable to or very different to Mexican or Latin American Gothic?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and congratulations to all my colleagues. Well, to answer that question, how can we compare Japanese Gothic fiction to Mexican Gothic fiction if we read them by that scope? I think mainly because both talk about human emotions. Human emotions are, I think, I may be a little overreacting with this, but I think I'm not. I think human emotions are universal, despite cultural backgrounds, countries, languages, traditions, etc. And Pedro Páramo, as many of you may know, as many of you may have read, it's a novel about dead people. An entire town is inhabited by dead people, and even the main protagonist finds later on that he is also dead. Well, that is basically the plot. Obviously, a lot of more things happen throughout the narrative, much more things, but basically that's the gist. And in No Longer Human by Dasai, it's a very different approach to horror, but I think there could be some connection, some linking between a town inhabited by dead people and a person who is afraid of everyone around him. I think fear is what may link together the two texts. And I would like also to point out that Dasai's novel is not very explicit with its horror elements. It is, by contrast, very subtle. Many scenes which depict sex, suicide, debauchery, bereavement, violence, domestic abuse, etc., are suggested rather than explicitly described. And by contrast, Ethos exploits that type of scenarios or scenes because he wanted to highlight as much as possible the horror, let us say, stem, the horror nucleus that the size novel has. But my main purpose by analyzing, by examining this adaptation was to try to read literature from other countries, from other backgrounds that are commonly not read throughout Gothic scope, but that doesn't deprive us as critics, as readers, to read them through that. And it's the same with Pedro Páramo. I think Tony has worked with that novel before from that perspective, but commonly Pedro Páramo, at least here in Mexico, is not read like that. It's not considered a Gothic novel per se. I think Gothic, it's a framework to read literature or other type of media. And that's how I think it is possible to compare not only novels, not only texts, but also visual media like manga or graphical novels, or even series or even movies. And back to you, Ilse. Thanks for the question, though.
Thank you very much, Julio. Thank you. And we're going to move on to some questions for our last speaker of the day, for Leonard. And there's at least a couple. Let me read from the chat. Okay, the first question is from Anna Reed, another presenter, and she's asking, she's saying the following: a question for Leonard, if he doesn't touch upon it in his fascinating paper. Is there a relationship between the Grand Guignol and Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire?
Not per se, but virtually all sort of a fair amount of horror literature and film, as well as certain Gothic narratives from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so forth, are clearly very much aware of the Grand Guignol, and Anne Rice knows a great deal about France as well. I'm assuming that she would be very much aware of it, in fact. And there's, of course, a theater scene in Interview with a Vampire, the Théâtre des Vampires in Paris, which has some fairly explicit theatrical representations, which situate themselves, at least when I think about it from the film. I don't remember so much the way it was described in the novel, but seems to situate itself between the melodrama of the early 19th century and the Grand Guignol at the end of the century. That's an interesting question, though. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And sorry, I had disappeared. There's another question as well for Leonard. And it is from Anthony Lopez, who's in the UK right now. And he asks the following: Leonard, have you found similar examples to the Grand Guignol in other countries, or is it somehow a French phenomenon?
It seems to be primarily a French phenomenon. Towards the end of my paper, I at least mentioned this. In the 1920s, there was an attempt to export the Grand Guignol style to Italy. For 2 brief years, there was a Grand Guignol theater in Paris at the Little Theater. In 1922, I believe. There was also an attempt in the 1930s to sort of import this style to New York. But in each of these instances, the Grand Guignol was unsuccessful anywhere else other than the Grand Guignol in Paris. And I'll also note too that there were no other Grand Guignol theaters in France. It was a strictly Parisian phenomenon, like some of the other kind of odd Parisian entertainments in the late 19th century and early 20th century. I think of how the Paris Morgue, for example, became a tourist attraction. That's something that you don't necessarily see anywhere else either. So perhaps it's something specific to not only France, but maybe even Paris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leonard. I don't know if any of our speakers would like to add, maybe if not a conclusion, an extra comment to this conversation.
I have a question for Esteban.
Please go ahead.
Do you hear me? Everyone, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering, Esteban, what is your opinion, your point of view about Shaun of the Dead? Because I think it's a very well constructed, a very smart zombie movie that deconstructs and also makes fun of zombie movies, but also offers a very interesting narrative, moving characters, relatable characters, and I think it's a very different approach. I have not read World War C novel, but I do find I have seen the movie and I agree with you. It's a very bland depiction of a pandemic, of a zombie pandemic. But what is your opinion about Shaun of the Dead? I would like to know your thoughts around it.
Well, thanks for the question. When it comes to Shaun of the Dead, quite honestly, I haven't seen it in quite a while. I do remember enjoying it. It's yeah, very, very British in its sense of humor, which I enjoy. I think what makes Shaun of the Dead stand out, humor aside, and maybe because of that humor, at the end it's the conclusion where zombies seem to have been integrated into all facets of life. In that very brief montage at the end, where you see them in game shows and talk shows, and Shaun has his friend as a zombie, like chained up, and they're still playing video games. That I find interesting because it's in the same vein of ending as in World War Z, where zombies are now a widely accepted truth in the world, and humanity and society has managed to come back in spite of them and just integrate them, or integrate humanity back into this world where zombies exist. Completely different approaches, of course, where Shaun of the Dead takes a very comedic response to it, where World War Z takes a more somber response to it, of having to do annual cleanups of zombies that are still in the ocean and washing up ashore, that are frozen and then thaw every summer, and building houses again that are on stilts with walkways, so people are more connected but distance themselves from the ground. It's fascinating in that way. So yes, to answer your question, I really like Shaun of the Dead because it takes that approach of like, humanity fights back, let's imagine what world with zombies would be like. And I find that pretty cool. Thanks.
Thank you very much to Julio and to Esteban, of course. I would like to thank all of the speakers, all of the speakers in this panel today, and all of you watching and following the panel. I have two very brief announcements to make that Tony Alcalá asked me to make. The first one being, I would like to remind everyone there's more talks. There's a different panel tomorrow at 11 a.m. That would be the last panel. And also to watch out for the call for papers that's coming out next fall for the next Coloquio. Okay, so once again, thank you so much for being here, both speakers and members of the audience. Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Elise, very much. And watch out for zombies as well.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
likewise.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Likewise. Thank you, everyone.
Yes. Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Goodbye. Bye, Julio and Esteban. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Goodbye. Take care.